Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the former hedge fund billionaire turned Trump's chief economic cheerleader, appeared before the House Financial Services Committee today, and what unfolded was less of a serious oversight hearing and more of a taxpayer-funded infomercial for the Trump economy. Republican members lobbed softball after softball, inviting Bessent to recite administration talking points as though they were testifying at a campaign rally rather than conducting the people's business. Meanwhile, the American public is left to wonder, is this congressional oversight or congressional cheerleading?
Secretary, I'd love to give you a couple minutes to respond to some of the things the ranking member said, starting with the fact that 2 of the 3 largest bank failures in American history happened under President Biden, not President Trump. Correct?
Correct.
Number 2, under President Biden, we saw devastation in household after household after household. He dug a big hole where the average family was losing at the end of his term over $1,000 a month in spending power. Accurate?
I would say workers suffered under policies championed by the Biden-Warren economy.
And President Trump has had to fill that hole. As a matter of fact, we've seen some of the strongest GDP growth that we've seen in decades.
We've seen strong GDP growth in spite of many, but not all, of the members on the right, or my right side of the room, voting for the longest government shutdown in history. Despite that, we have seen extremely strong economic growth.
And if you look at the success, and this doesn't get a lot of attention, but let's make sure that it gets more today. If you look at the success of the Working Families Tax Cut bill, for those folks in blue-collar America, for the folks who are working every single day, sometimes 2 jobs, trying to make sure that their ends meet, when they look at sitting down at the kitchen table, wondering if anyone is paying attention in Washington to the suffering and the challenges around the country in their household, the answer today is absolutely, positively, unequivocally yes. We know that because in the Working Families Tax Cut bill, we saw tips. If you earn tips in America, your taxes went down significantly. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, sir. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security, deductibility of auto loans for American-made cars, and every Democrat voted against that and in favor of the largest tax hike in history.
Now, on top of that, because we understand that raising children have never been more expensive, and frankly, if you looked at the attempt of my friends on the left on child care, some of their proposals would have taken child care from average of $15,300 to $29,000 in some of the estimates given by their bill that they wanted to get passed under President Biden. We actually increased the child tax credit to $2,250, $2,200, right? $2,200. So when you compare the 2 economies and compare the 2 levels of leadership that we're seeing in great contrast, back-to-back leadership, there's no question that if you're looking for someone focusing on working class Americans, undeniably, that would be the Trump economy and the Trump administration.
Mr. Chairman, during Joe Biden's tenure, CPI was 4.7% on an annualized basis. Cumulative CPI was 21.5%. There was a loss of real purchasing power for working families. Thus far, we've seen an increase in real wages. CPI for 2025 was 2.7%, and we have seen it fall for the past 3 months to 2.1%. And there is an index called Trueflation, which is observed inflation, not measured inflation, which comes with a lag, that just fell below 1%.
Wow. I only have a minute left. I'm holding everyone to the same standard, including myself. So here's my probably not my last question, but I'm getting close to the end. When inflation in 2021 hit 9%, bad or good for the American economy?
Terrible. Terrible for the American economy, terrible for the American people.
Number 2, when President Trump has been able to keep inflation under 3%, still heading towards our goal of 2%, much, much better for our economy. And as a result, interest rates have been able to come down consistently.
Yes, we've seen the interest rates come down this year, and the 10-year U.S. Treasury had its best year since 2020, when the bond markets and our G7 colleagues actually had rate hikes. We had rate decreases.
I only have 10 seconds. At the end of the day, home ownership and affordability is more likely now in the Trump economy than it ever would have been under the Biden economy.
A member of Congress did not ask Secretary Bessent a single challenging question, not one. Instead, he served up a series of leading statements, each one gift-wrapped with the expected answer, and Bessent, a man who once managed billions on Wall Street, was reduced to a role that required nothing more than nodding and saying, "Correct, yes, sir," and at one point, an almost theatrical "wow," as though he were hearing his own administration's inflation figures for the very first time on live television. The congressman opened by pointing to two of the three largest bank failures in American history occurring under President Biden. That is technically accurate. Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic Bank did collapse in 2023. But what he conveniently failed to mention is that those failures were largely the consequence of the Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hikes that were necessary precisely because of the inflation that built up during and after the pandemic, under policies that both administrations had a hand in. The deregulatory environment that made those banks vulnerable, that traces directly back to the 2018 rollback of Dodd-Frank signed by Donald Trump. Then came the claim that families lost over $1,000 a month in purchasing power under Biden, a striking number and one that deserves context. But by the end of the Biden presidency, real wages had begun to recover, and the labor market was historically strong, with unemployment near half-century lows. None of that made it into this exchange, of course, because context is the enemy of a good talking point. Secretary Bessent then introduced an interesting phrase, the Biden-Warren economy, a deliberate rhetorical move designed to tie Senator Elizabeth Warren, a figure deeply unpopular with Wall Street and conservative voters, to every economic hardship of the past 4 years. It's clever politics. It is not serious economics. The congressman then pivoted to the working families tax cut bill, rattling off provisions: no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security, deductibility of auto loans for American-made cars, as though reading from a campaign brochure. And to be fair, some of these provisions do benefit working Americans. But here's what wasn't said. The bulk of the tax bill's benefits flow to corporations and high earners. The child tax credit was raised to $2,200, which sounds generous until you remember that Democrats, under the American Rescue Plan, had temporarily raised it to $3,600 per child, a policy that cut child poverty nearly in half. The Republican majority let that expire. So when they boast about $2,200, they are celebrating a number that is $1,500 less than what families were already receiving and calling it progress. Perhaps the most revealing moment came when the congressman cited Trueflation, an alternative crypto-adjacent inflation index, as evidence that inflation has fallen below 1%. Secretary Bessent's response? Wow. Now, Trueflation is not a government metric. It is not used by the Federal Reserve, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or any credible central bank on Earth. It is an experimental blockchain-based index. And yet, here it was, cited on the floor of the United States Congress as though it were gospel, and the Treasury Secretary of the most powerful economy in the world responded not with scrutiny, not with qualification, but with wonder. That should concern every American who expects their government to deal in verified data rather than convenient narratives. The congressman closed with a sweeping declaration that homeownership is more likely under the Trump economy than it ever would have been under Biden, but the numbers tell a different story. Mortgage rates, while slightly improved, remain above 6%. Home prices have not meaningfully corrected. And for millions of young Americans, the dream of owning a home remains exactly that, a dream. No amount of hearing room theatrics changes that reality. What we witnessed today was not oversight. It was validation. A powerful government official was invited not to be questioned, but to be affirmed. And in a functioning democracy, that should trouble us regardless of which party holds the gavel.